when you are selling the property, remember we're in the buyer section now, right? We're talking about selling the properties. Now, if you were to offer the property with seller financing, just remember something. Unlike when we lease a property and have the option to buy it later during the term of our lease, where the owner is still going to be responsible for taxes and insurance. Why? Because they still own it. When you sell the house on owner financing, when you sell it, now you're transferring the deed. You're talking about transferring ownership, and all you have is a note and a mortgage that says that somebody's going to pay you on X schedule, and it's protected and backed up by the house as collateral. But because you don't own it, the only thing you own is a promissory note and the security of knowing you can get the house back if they don't pay on that promissory note. You don't own it anything more than that anymore. Your buyer would actually own the house. So whoever owns the house, they are responsible for the taxes on the house and the insurance on the house. Not to go down, on a tangent, but you have some of these morons out here saying that you take over a property subject to and you don't have to change the insurance because the insurance is embedded within the escrow payment that's on the seller's loan. Well, try making a claim on that. They find out that there's a fire and the insurance company finds out that deed transferred. They're not on the hook anymore because you don't have an insurance policy with them. The seller did. Well, that seller doesn't even own the property anymore. Okay, the insurance doesn't follow the house, it follows the owner, just like taxes do. The taxes follow the owner. Let's look at a mathematical example to bring more clarity to this. And I know for some of you this might be basic, but there has been quite a lot of confusion on this for some reason. So I'm trying to be a little bit more granular. When we figure out what our cash flow is going to be on a property, we got to keep what I just said in mind. So let me give you an example of how this can bite you if you don't do it the right way. Let's say we buy a house now, okay? We buy a house. There's a $300,000 underlying loan on it, and the principal, the interest, the taxes, the insurance, it's all embedded, amounted to $2,000 of principal and interest and $700 of taxes and insurance for a total PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance of $2,700. Now let's say we go out and sell this property, and maybe we're in Texas, so we decide to sell with seller financing, and we sell it for $350,000. We pick up $50,000 down, and we're owed $300,000. Just like over here, we owe our seller $300,000, but over here, our buyer owes us $300,000, but it's probably at a higher interest rate, right? 8.9% interest. We amortize it for 30 years, and when you do that on a financial calculator, you'll come up with $2,392. In other words, $300,000 amortized over 30 years at 8.9% is a payment of $2,392. So you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute now, how's that going to work? I got to pay $2,700 to my seller, and I only have $2,392 coming in. No, because there's more to do. The $2,392 that's being collected is for the principal and interest on this loan. But because you're selling, deed transferring, ownership transferring, title company involved, title transferring, the new buyer is going to have to pay those taxes and insurance. And we want to be sure that taxes and insurance are being paid so that we protect our seller and protect ourselves. So just like a bank does, we're going to embed the taxes and insurance payment that they're going to make us along with the payment of principal and interest. Your payment on this loan is $2,392 with taxes and insurance. We'll go ahead and take care of that for you. We add $700 of that. That's going to take us over $3,000, right? Now we're whole, more than whole, because after we've added in the taxes and in the insurance, the payment for our buyer is now $3,092, and we have $392 of positive cash flow. Now, having said all of that, sometimes the buyer is going to want to just take care of taxes and insurance on their own. I don't want them to do that because I don't want to have to be checking. Sometimes, though, you don't want to break the deal, so you might acquiesce on that. But understand that you're going to have $2,392 coming in. They're going to effectively have to pay you the taxes because there's an underlying loan on it. The insurance might. I'm not even going to let them do it in this particular situation because there's an underlying loan. I might do it on an owner finance situation. But on an underlying loan, we're not going to convince the bank to take the taxes and insurance out. We don't want to be contacting the bank. So we have to explain to our buyer here that the taxes are already embedded. We have to change the insurance policy because you're now the owner, and we'll submit that into the underlying loan that you're wrapping around because we're creating a wraparound mortgage in this situation. But at the end of the day, because you've sold it, you have positive cash flow. Now, if you lease it, so let's say you bought it this way, but you're leasing it with an option. So lease with an option $350, we pick up 50 grand down, and we tell them the payment is $23.92. Now you have negative cash flow because the tenant buyer isn't responsible for the taxes and insurance. You still are, you own it. So we would raise the lease payment higher to account for the $2,700 so that we don't have negative cash flow. We could go a lot higher than $2,700, or we could go as low as $2,700. We could go a little lower even if we give them a short term, right? Because we could have negative cash flow if we're getting 50 grand down. We're not going to lose all that in a year or two if we have $100, $200 of negative cash flow. This is what I mean by you have to think cubically, right? Like a Rubik's Cube in a way. It's not just linear, where there's just a straight black and white answer to every question. All of these currents come together, and you have to determine whether or not it's a good deal or not. That's why we have the deal evaluation form, because one little thing changes the other, and so on and so forth. Okay, so just bear that in mind. When you own, you're responsible for taxes and insurance. When somebody else owns, they're responsible for taxes and insurance. All right, now here's one of the things that happens, also going back to what we talked about yesterday. Sometimes your buyer is putting a significant amount of money down. They are using an attorney. This more often happens on the higher end properties. You've seen some of the properties I've done where we're up as high as $4 million, lease optioning a $4 million house. Somebody's giving you $250,000 down on that $4 million house. It's not very much, is it? It's not even 10%. So, but it's still a lot of money. Are reluctant to put $250,000 down on and just have a lease and not even have a recorded option. And a lot of times, especially when you're talking about that kind of a value of a house, their attorney will point that out and try to negotiate something that can still be fair, but they want to give their buyer a little bit more grip on the deal, a little bit more traction. And they ask for a land contract maybe. They ask for, like a contract for deed, meaning you don't really transfer the deed, but you give them a contract. When they get to a certain point, they get the deed. Now, that still pushes you into foreclosure in almost every state if they stop paying. So I don't really like that either. I would much rather simply lease it to them, give them the option to buy, and we'll call it a day when they're ready to exercise their option. If not, I don't want a whole lot of hassle getting the property back into my name or my entity's name. So if you're going to do this, which you can do, because you are going to be asked, not all the time, but on higher end properties often, even on lower end properties sometimes, make sure you understand, or your attorney has briefed you on the pathway that you'd have to go through to repossess the house. Because when you give ownership to somebody else, taking it back is hard. That saying, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? That's not exactly true when someone leases the house, because we have eviction proceedings that can get somebody out of the house as long as I'm the owner of the house. Okay, so I want to know what the pathway to repossession of the house is if my buyer defaults and ends up not cooperating with me. Michael asks, what is a land contract? His seller mentioned that. A land contract simply means that you're going to make monthly payments on the house, and there's a contract to deliver the land, which basically is the deed, right? To deliver the land, the house, the deed, the ownership at a certain point in time, after you've achieved a certain amount of equity, after you've put a certain amount down in, after a certain amount of time has gone by. It's sort of a go-between. If you look at like a seller financing where you're just giving them the deed at the close over on this end of the spectrum, and a lease option where they don't get the deed until all of the money comes in, a land contract can be considered a happy medium. It's also known as a contract for deed. So I'd rather buy with seller financing number one, land contract number two, contract for deed, agreement for deed. They're called different things in different states. Bond for deed. A lease option would be my least favorite acquisition strategy when we talk about doing terms. It doesn't mean that I don't like the strategy. It just means that I'm going to always push to actually get the deed. Getting a land contract is a little bit better, but if they're going to do that, I'd rather just have them seller finance it to me. Let me get the deed to the property. I can almost always get them over the hump. If I'm dealing with a buyer and they're insisting on seller financing for the same reasons I usually do with sellers, I can almost always get them over the hump and get them to take it as a lease option. So I don't even make that compromise most of the time, and I'd suggest you probably don't need to either, unless it's a special circumstance. But I wanted to at least put some information on it because it will come up. So we need to understand what the possibilities are here so that we can sleep well at night and know that we're making a good decision on the properties that we're buying. So we want to learn wherever we own a property, what that foreclosure process is, what the timeline might be, because that will convince you to take a lower or higher down payment based on how difficult the pathway is to go down if you have to repossess the house after selling it in a manner that involves transferring the deed. Again, that's why I would rather just lease option it. But in Nevada, I'll lease option properties for very, very low down, but the lower end of my range. Like, let's say that a target range, I hate to even express this to you because I don't want you guys going for this because you end up limiting your upside. Let people tell you what they can pay down and you decide if you like it or not. Don't say you got to put 8% down. Okay, that makes it seem like that's what the price is. The price depends on a mix of factors, but we pretty much average around 8% on when we sell a house with a lease and an option to buy. That's usually enough to make me feel comfortable, protect me. So on a $500,000 house, we're getting 40 grand down. On a $250,000 house, we're getting, around 20 grand or whatever. So, but I don't want to take much less than that. In a place like Nevada, if I have a $250,000 house, I might be willing to take 20 grand down. In a place like Chicago, a $250,000 house, I don't want 20 grand down. I want way more because I know if I have to evict, it's going to be a pain in the ass. Sorry for cussing. So now, particularly the foreclosure process, eviction usually is, manageable everywhere. But, places like California, People's Republic, that kind of thing, you could be looking at a long time. So we want to make sure that we have enough money to handle the trough that could occur for a few months. When you transfer the deed, you could be looking at the better part of a year before you get that property back. Now, as a last resort, if you really want a particular buyer and you're at an impasse on this point of just lease optioning it versus seller financing it, you can go to them and say, well, look, here's what we'll do. We will put together a contract for deed that spells out when the deed actually transfers to you, and use a land contract or a contract for deed like I talked about in the very beginning of the slides, which you'll have to go through to check it out. The problem I have with that and why I don't normally do that is most states, if you execute a land contract or a contract for deed, you've given them enough equitable interest in the property that if they just stop paying, there's a question about their ownership interest, and it means that you have to go to foreclosure court to get them out instead of eviction court. They aren't just mere tenants. They own a contract for that land or contract for that deed, and just extinguishing that is much more difficult than extinguishing an option to buy, which is flimsy. I mean, they have a lease. They just have to not violate the lease. If they don't violate the lease, they have the option, and that's totally enforceable. And if before I would even go to this, I'd probably let them record the option or something to give them, more protection. Can almost always convince them. If you get yourself in that situation, let me know. I'll try to help you out. Never end up having to do this, but sometimes with a land contract for deed, it might be a shorter process, but sometimes not. Here's the thing. I want a personal guarantee from my buyer. Now, I'm not going to be giving that to anyone as a seller. We're operating a business, and we're going to operate it as such. But when I'm installing a buyer in one of my properties that my entity owns, they're going to personally guarantee it. They're going to be living there, and they're going to personally guarantee it. Okay? So without having to read this whole thing, this is what a personal guarantee looks like, and we have this paperwork just so you know.